Hello and welcome to The Hindu. This is Meera Srinivasan. Zohran Mamdani's election this week as New York City's mayor is a story that has traveled far beyond the city's 5 boroughs. His grounded campaign and decisive win carry important lessons for those trying to combat right-wing and reactionary forces elsewhere. What does Mamdani's victory mean for the Democratic Party establishment, national politics in the Trump era, and for movements beyond the US? Why did Mamdani's campaign, centered on affordability and equality, resonate with so many residing in one of the richest cities in the world? To break this all down for us, we have a very special guest today, Corey Robin, who is a noted American political theorist. He has written extensively on both the right and the left, drawing on history and contemporary politics to make sense of power and ideology today. He is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College and the City University of New York or CUNY Graduate Center. Professor Robin is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump. His writing appears regularly in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, New Left Review, and he's a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine. He's speaking to us from Princeton, New Jersey, where he's currently a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. Welcome to the show, Professor Robin, and many thanks for joining us. So, Professor Robin, Zohran Mamdani's success has drawn a lot of attention globally for many reasons. His identity, his origins, his clear messaging and sharp campaign, and the politics that the campaign foregrounded. What do you think is the most striking aspect of his victory, and how does it impact national politics?
I think probably the most significant aspect of his victory is that it has been built for over a decade, going back to the early 2010s with the rise of Democratic Socialists of America, which had been a moribund organization, but got a new lease on life after Occupy and the financial crisis. There's been a tremendous amount of grassroots organizing. Zohran Mamdani comes out of that group. He himself was an organizer and a campaigner. So I think, and this was a small group that started, and that ultimately, I think that by election day, had over 100,000 volunteers canvassing door to door for him. So I think it's a real triumph of a kind of democratic action, grassroots, door to door, member to member, that we haven't seen in this country for a long time, and the significance of which I think has vast implications beyond just New York City.
You said you talked about Occupy Wall Street. I mean, we saw the movement erupt on the streets of New York in 2011. And then we saw, as you mentioned, the rise of Bernie Sanders, especially in 2015-16, and the resurgence of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, and we saw its membership surge at that time. And then in 2018, we saw the emergence of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as she's better known. And now we're seeing the Mamdani moment. What do these tell us really about the prospects for the American left in the Donald Trump era? I saw that you've called Mamdani's victory a continuation of the Nevada moment, referring to the time Sanders won in 2020 in the Democratic primaries. So can you elaborate?
Yeah, let's just start with that Nevada moment in the primary in Nevada. What was so, and people have forgotten about this moment because it was obscured by what immediately followed, which was the election of Joe Biden, the nomination of Joe Biden, and then, of course, COVID shutting everything down. But for this moment in Nevada, what you saw there was a coalition of much younger voters, working class, many of them Latino, working as housekeepers in the hotel industry, who really rallied behind this old white Jewish socialist guy who was originally from New York City. And that connection that was forged there really showed that democratic socialism could speak beyond the boundaries of identity, beyond the boundaries of native born versus immigrant. And then lastly, beyond generations, one of the most fantastic elements of that moment was the way in which these younger Latino voters really went and spoke to their parents and grandparents who were a little bit more skeptical, a little bit conservative, and persuaded them to vote for Bernie. We saw an extremely similar phenomenon here in New York City. Younger South Asian voters really, and South Asian voters make up an increasingly large part of the population. Many of them are students on my campus, City University, where I teach. And we saw them, rally behind Mamdani, but more than that, talk to their families, talk to their extended networks. And it was really something. When you were out canvassing, you would see older Bangladeshi women also suddenly out, going door to door in neighborhoods that are called Little Bangladesh here in New York City. And so I think that cross-generational, cross-class, cross-immigrant, and cross-cultural alliance is something that the left has really been working on, for about 10 years. And it's amazing to see how it moves from city to city and gets
right.
larger.
So in a way, is it fair to say that although the Democratic Party denied candidacy to Sanders twice, he didn't let it become a political setback, and the movement did not construe it as a setback. It continued its work, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Bernie Sanders has always been in this fight for the long haul. He started off as a mayor of Burlington. I mean, even before that, he was an activist. So he's been doing this forever. And far from him being focused on himself or his own campaigns, he's always very clearly understood his role in his campaign to be seeding something for the future. And we saw it, with the election of AOC, and we saw it in Nevada, and now we see it with Mamdani, who really, to his credit, really credits Bernie Sanders with being the inspiration. And it's just, if you have any sense of American history, Bernie Sanders comes out of the 1960s. As I said, he was born in Brooklyn. He was the son of immigrants, working class. This is a campaign now with Mamdani where you just see the torch of American progressive history just being passed to a new generation. And I have to just say, it's hard not to get emotional and excited about the fact that this new generation is immigrants, is from, in Mamdani's case, South Asia. And it just reprises a story of American history that was mostly about Eastern Europe, but now reflects the new global economy and the new global reality. And therefore,
thank you, Professor Robin. That was beautiful imagery and actually the passing on of the torch. So we saw that Mamdani's central campaign plank was affordability and equality. Now, speaking to ordinary people's everyday struggles around affordable housing, childcare, better public transport, he galvanized very diverse groups of New Yorkers and winning despite the many targeted attacks he faced from different quarters. From his campaign and the precedents we saw in the mobilizations around Sanders, AOC, and the rise of the DSA itself, it would seem that there is ample political logic for the Democratic Party establishment to move away from centrism and make a considered shift to the left. Why isn't the party willing or able to do that?
I just want to emphasize what you're saying there, because there's been a lot of talk about how, well, this is New York City. New York City is different. It's more progressive. It's more radical. Of course, as Mamdani said, New York City is the city that produced Donald Trump. He's from New York City. He speaks to a certain constituency. So I think the idea that somehow or another New York City is an outlier in comparison to the rest of America is a bit overstated. And what we found out is that New York City residents and citizens are facing some of the same struggles that people throughout the entire country are. I mean, the question of housing is not, it may be more expensive in New York, but I was just out in Minnesota, in southern Minnesota, and in a very small town, and the very same issues were being discussed there among younger people about how hard it is to get a house and so forth. So these are problems. And when you ask, why is it that the Democratic Party won't speak to it? I think it has to do with two reasons. One is, for the last 30 to 40 years, the Democratic Party has been run by a group of fairly elite people who see their first task to be to satisfy donors. And those donors are rich people. And we saw them here in this campaign against Mamdani. They came out very, very strongly against him. The people who were the loudest against Mamdani were not Republicans. They were not Trump supporters. They were very elite, wealthy Democrats. And it gave you, I think, a prism of who really leads the Democratic Party. And so when you ask, why won't they do this? That's one part of the answer. And I think the other part of the answer is coming out of the 1970s and the rise of right-wing, populism, which is not a new thing in this country. It's quite old. There was a certain sector of the Democratic Party that felt like the way to win elections was to track to the center, that liberalism and progressivism in the left were liabilities. And so you came up with this politics that was extraordinarily centrist. But as I think Mamdani really exposed in this election, what that centrism, that center versus left argument conceals is that what the centrists have to offer to the American voter is the following message. As my colleague Liza Featherstone, who's a journalist here in New York, says, the message of the center is nothing can get better. Nothing will get better. Vote for me in order to ensure that nothing gets better. That is the message. And you can't, it's hard to get people out to vote in order to keep things as bad as they are. You might as well stay home. And I think what Mamdani really tapped into is you're going to have to turn the corner on that. You're going to have to really say things can get better, and not in a kind of tinkering, narrow way. We're going to try to get this little prescription drug price down to this. It's going to have to really deal with the fundamentals. And Mamdani dealt with the fundamentals. If you're, just starting out as a person, whether as part of a family or not, housing, childcare, if you are part of a family, and transportation. These are key things, and they have to be dealt with, or else people won't.
No, I ask this also because we see this tendency in other contexts. Many who are part of the political or parliamentary left, even without compulsions of an elite establishment, contend that embracing centrism or backing a centrist party is inevitable in their fight against fascism or authoritarianism in their respective contexts. What do you make of that argument coming from the left?
We try. I was never persuaded by it, but let's at least say we gave it a try with Hillary Clinton, who lost, and then we gave it a try with Joe Biden. And even though, what enabled Joe Biden to win that election was that he, in fact, did track to the left. But then it was the centrist votes and voices within the Democratic Party that pulled it back. And lo and behold, he lost. Not he, but Kamala Harris lost that election. So I would say we've now tried this several times, the tacking to the center. And what we have discovered is far from keeping Trump out of power, he gets stronger. He's been emboldened in this second term. And I think Mamdani put this very well on election night. He said, I am not, and we are not just fighting Donald Trump. We are fighting the next Donald Trump. And that's really important. And, even if you can win a temporary victory against Donald Trump, which I wouldn't poo-poo, it's not enough, we've discovered, to stop the larger movement. And the left, or I should say the Democratic Party and the centrists in the Democratic Party, have had nothing to offer the voter against Donald Trump. And I think, Mamdani, what he's really made very clear is the fight against authoritarianism and the fight for affordability are the flip sides of the same coin. You cannot separate the fight for democracy to be just a fight about the purity of your elections and the purity of your constitution and the purity of your laws. People want democracy. Democracy was always a movement historically of the commoners, and they didn't fight for it because they were just democratically minded people who were good people as against bad people. They fought for democracy because they wanted to represent and secure their interests. And I think what Mamdani has made very clear is people will fight for democracy if they feel like the people who are speaking for democracy speak for them. And just to put a finer point on this, we got the largest turnout in New York City for this election we've had since 1969. That it is, we're pushing on, if my math is right, almost 60 years there. And that turnout, that electoral participation, which is such a sign of democratic resurgence, was very much tied to Mamdani's promise that if you turn out to vote, we can do something about this. One last thing, and not just turn out to vote. Unlike other Democrats, Mamdani, just after the election, has now set up an organization to make sure that the people who canvass for him for the vote will stay active in ensuring the passage of his platform. And I think that's the other thing. It's not to just for him to, for us to vote for him and then for him to turn the lock, put the key and turn the lock, and then suddenly it's paradise. It's going to require the ongoing activism, the ongoing mobilization of citizens. And again, you couldn't ask for a better statement of democratic faith than that.
Yeah, as you say, Mamdani's win is undoubtedly remarkable and comes after a lot of hard work by a whole lot of people, active mobilization, door-to-door campaign, and a very consistent movement building exercise. But there are many challenges that we see that entail his victory, as you just said, and his ability to deliver on promises hinges on so many contingencies. And meanwhile, there is this political mobilization that's brimming with energy, with hope. And how can the movement retain this momentum while Mamdani confronts structural challenges and institutional limits, and also contends with a party whose establishment is at best lukewarm about his victory?
I think in a way you've answered your own question. The only way we have discovered, the only way to confront a party establishment that's lukewarm, the only way to confront the institutional intransigence and the opposition of money and power is precisely for people to stay mobilized. I feel like one of the things that has happened, I say this as a political scientist and a political theorist, our understanding of democracy has really shrunken and gotten narrow in the last 50 years or so. It really, I think, following the end of the Cold War, it became understood to be that democracy was simply the casting of the vote, casting of a ballot. And the truth of the matter is that that's a very narrow understanding of democracy. It's never been enough to secure the things that we think that the kind of equality and freedom we associate with democracy. And now it's going to be put to the test right now. I think certainly everybody I know who has voted for Mamdani and has invested their faith in him, they understand full well that the fight really has begun the day after he was elected, and that the passage of his platform is by no means assured, precisely because there are all those forces that you just cited that are arrayed against him. And there's only, and I think Bernie Sanders and AOC have been equally clear about this. There's only one way to battle those forces, and that's to continue the mobilization after the election. And just one last point about this. This is a real contrast, I think, to the election campaign and victory of Barack Obama back in 2008, which was also a very strong grassroots, youth-driven campaign. The difference was, after the election, Obama and the Democrats thought, okay, goodbye, everybody. Let's all go back home, and now we'll start the negotiations, and now we will deal with our friends and partners across the aisle. And lo and behold, what did those friends and partners across the aisle do? They stymied his program, and it really got shrunk. I think we've gone through a generation of that business of give me your vote and I'll do what you want, or do something of what you want. I don't think we're there anymore. And I think people have a very sharp understanding that to get this program passed, it's going to require pressure from the street. And that, again, is, that's what the Black freedom struggle was about in the 1960s. That's what the New Deal was about in the 1930s. So I think there's a long history that Mamdani is renewing for all of us.
Just to ask you a broader question, Professor Robin, in your work, you argue that the left needs to better understand the right and reactionary forces in order to combat them effectively. You note that the right is neither stupid or, nor a static force, and that it's dynamic and constantly adapts to the present. So, do you think the left is getting better at reading the right?
Yes and no. I mean, when I wrote my book, it came out in 2011. I think there were many on the liberal side and even people on the left who thought that the right was basically, the kind of the responsible party, the people who knew what to do with your money, and wouldn't waste it and spend it, and the people who weren't crazy. And the argument in my book was that the right is far more radical than that. And I think that has become clear. I mean, I don't think I persuaded people of that. I think Donald Trump and the Republican Party persuaded people of that. So I think that has become clear. What I think the left still has not figured out are some of the issues that we've been talking about, how to make the connection between democracy as an institution, as a set of rules and a set of elections, and economic equality. I think the left, and the Democrats, we often separate those two things. We focus on the institutions and the Constitution and the rules, not enough on what's the outcome of that. So there's a kind of fussiness, a kind of teacherliness, if you will, a kind of professorism that the left, I think, still has to overcome and realize that no, democracy is really about how people lead their everyday lives. And if you can't make that connection, you're not going to be able to fight the right. So I think that's one aspect. I think the other thing that the left has had a hard time figuring out is the relationship between what we call identity politics and economic democracy. This has been a fight that has pitted the left against the left. And I think what's just so exciting about Mamdani is he sort of solves that problem in one fell swoop. I mean, he's embraced his identity. I don't think anybody doesn't know at this point that he's Muslim, that he's from South Asia, that he was, born in Uganda. And he wears that background and that faith proudly. But it's all in service of a message that speaks to people who may not be South Asian, who may not have been born in Uganda, but who, deal with affordability. And I think there was a quick interview with him and somebody said, what do you have to say to right-wing voters, who don't like you and don't want to support you? And he's very, without, skipping a beat, he said, you still got to pay your rent. That's a way of connecting with people across a divide. Does it mean it trumps the divides of ethnicity and race? Of course not. But Mamdani, what I love about him is he doesn't run away from his background. It's not as if the Democratic Party is settling on some, white working class guy to represent them in this instance. They chose him, but he speaks, the language of economic equality, of freedom and dignity for all people. And I think it's just, I think what people love about it is that it seems so authentic. It seems like he's not pivoting. He never pivots from one thing to the other. He's always speaking of everything at the same time, and yet sounds very clear and intelligible at the same
Indeed.
time.
No, just listening to Professor Robin, the points that you made about the left, confronting this tension at one point between identity politics and class politics, and then the separation of civil and political rights and economic rights and social cultural rights or economic justice questions. This sort of keeps coming up every now and then. And as you say, Mamdani's campaign gives us clear messages that, with the campaign grounded in a class analysis and a commitment to economic justice, it's possible to speak to these challenges in very convincing ways, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in a way, there's a precedent for this in American history, which we go back to the 1930s. And the New Deal. I mean, who were the people who powered that New Deal? They were themselves either immigrants or the children of immigrants. In 1924, the United States cut off immigration from most of Europe because, Eastern Europeans, Jewish Europeans, Italian Europeans were thought to be kind of from the periphery and, not white enough. And what happened then in the 1930s? Those people who were not thought to be true Americans reinvented America. And so, all the culture in the name of economic equality and working class equality, and then the culture that came out of that, all the movies that we see in the 1950s, Marlon Brando, all those characters, they're all coded as, they're not white waspy characters. They're Italian, they're Jewish, they're ethnic. And that's the story of how America was recreated by the last generation of immigrant socialists. And I think Mamdani now, I mean, I was just so thrilled on election night when at the end music came on, and it was, from South Indian or South Asian music. And, that was like America seeing its next generation of music on the and hearing it. And so I think Mamdani really is part of that story that there is a precedent for, and hopefully will, not do two things. One is change the dynamic in American history and really shut the door on Trumpism, which really wants to stop a process that's already begun and happening in everyday life.
No, this has been amazing, Professor Robin. Thank you so much for unpacking this very, very important moment in American politics and history. Really appreciated your insights. Thank you so much for making time and joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm very grateful that an election like this can get attention across the world like this. So thank you.